Good morning, everyone. Welcome on behalf of Georgetown University Law Center to the 6th annual, I believe, Health Privacy Summit, Future of Privacy Summit. My hat is off to you, Deb. If I were to assemble a dream team of folks to work on this set of issues, I think this would be it. And we are tremendously lucky at Georgetown to have all of you for this gathering of great expertise and insight. For me personally, the issues at the heart of the gathering today came, I think I woke up to them when I learned about a study that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, conducted in 2014, it was, I believe. This was a year or two into the explosion of health and fitness apps and wearables. And the FTC wanted to see what exactly these devices were collecting and who exactly they were sharing it with. And so they picked 12 popular health and fitness apps, several of them which were tied to wearables. And they started poking around and seeing what information they were sending to whom. They discovered, as many of you probably know already, that these 12 apps were sharing their users' information with 76 different third parties. Some of these apps shared, I think at least one of them shared their users' information with at least 18 different third parties. And actually gets a little worse because each of those third parties was working, apparently, to gather information from more than one app. And so some of these third parties were getting streams of data from as many as 4 or 5 different apps. And so one entity, unbeknownst to the user of these apps, would be seeing a cross-section of that person's life. Everything from relatively innocuous, I went for a run this morning, relatively, to this is what I ate, to these are my symptoms, to I am in the second trimester of my pregnancy, what should I be eating? What vitamins should I be taking? One third party had access to all of this information from a cross-section of apps. And I think our outrage is stemmed a little bit from all of this being so opaque and non-transparent to us, right? If you told a friend, hey, I have this health condition, I'm wondering whether I have this disease or this illness, and they went out and told 18 different people, that would be the end of that relationship probably, right? And yet, our privacy laws are not ready for this reality. What's more, I think it's very important to point out that what we are seeing in this space is just one slice of a much bigger problem, which is the digitization of our physical lives, the digitization of our bodies, and the unpreparedness of privacy laws to deal with it. As all of you know, probably better than I, HIPAA and the HITECH Act were not written for a world where our most sensitive health information lives in our doctor's office, lives with our insurers, but also lives in our homes, and also lives in our smartphones, and also lives in a cloud, and also lives with third-party advertisers we've never heard of. We are not ready for that. And in the same way, we're not ready for technology like geolocation technology. We're not ready for Internet of Things technology. We're not ready for facial recognition technology, which is something that at the Center on Privacy and Technology we're spending a lot of time focused on. What do I mean by that? Right now, some of the largest companies in the world, Walmart, Saks Fifth Avenue, are actually using facial recognition technology to identify you the moment you walk into a store and see if you are on a hot list. And this is being replicated in law enforcement. This is being replicated in the national security sector. Our bodies are being digitized, and the law is not ready for it. If you believe, as I do, that we need to update our privacy laws to respond to this reality, then you and we face an uphill battle. I think a lot of attention post-Edward Snowden, and rightfully so, I think, has been paid to the national security debate. I will point out, however, that 1 year after Edward Snowden's revelations, the House of Representatives had passed a bill, it's not a perfect bill, but a bill, to respond to what he revealed. 2 years after that, President Obama was signing a version of that bill into law. Since 2009, on the other hand, the United States Congress has passed not 10, not 20, not 5, but one commercial privacy law having to do with a small slice of data collected by EDRs, sort of black boxes in our cars. And so while the incursion of the government into our lives is ever more apparent, at the same time, as we all know, private entities, and we are welcoming them into our lives because they benefit us, are also making those incursions, and yet our privacy law is not being updated for that. I could tell you stories from my time on the Hill as to why I think that's happening, but that is for another day. We are extraordinarily lucky to have with us Professor Joseph Cannataci, Joe Cannataci. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Privacy, appointed in 2015 for a 3-year term. He is the chair of European Information Policy and Technology Law at the University of Groningen. He is the head of the Department of Information Policy and Governance at the Faculty of Media and Knowledge Sciences at the University of Malta. He is a luminary and he is a leader. And I will say just 2 things on this account. The first is that all of these debates, if we were facing an uphill battle, the grade got a lot less steep the day that Joe Cannataci was appointed to the Special Rapporteur position. And I will add to that I have been privileged to participate in Joe's mapping initiative, which is trying to provide a roadmap for the EU on issues of privacy. We have ahead of us an extraordinary year or 2 in the relationship between the United States and Europe on privacy. Privacy Shield, which debuted a couple months ago, has been called into question. The GDPR, the General Commercial Privacy Data Protection Law, a major update since 1995, will come into effect in 2018. There is going to need to be a lot of work to ensure that our systems are still compatible. And thanks to Joe, I think we stand an even better chance of that actually working. So if you will please join me in welcoming Professor Cannataci, Special Rapporteur on Privacy. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Alvaro, for those kind words. No pressure, really, is it? So let me quickly move to the PowerPoint that I've prepared for today and take you with me. I'm told I have about 15 minutes an hour. And let's take off, because as Alvaro was saying, there's so much to do, so much to talk about. When you might be asking yourself, so what are we going to be talking about today, right? Well, this is, of course, Louis Brandeis. And if you want to hear me talking about him and my relationship with him, you'll have to come tonight, as Deb was saying, because I don't have enough time to do it this morning. But actually, Deb, I'll be saying a few things about myself and Brandeis, which even you don't know about. So you might want to come too this evening. Anyway, so what did I think I'll talk about this morning? Since you're in for 2 days about medical data, I am going to talk about medical data, but my main focus is to try to put it in the big picture, why it's important, and a few things which hopefully will then help you make the rest of medical data fit into the larger problems we have today. So I'm going to talk about why we should care, why privacy. Is it an end in itself? Is it a means to an end? And I'm going to talk about some scenarios and reflections on big data, and then finally where health data fits in. And I'd like to make a deal with you, right? And the deal is, when you see the sign going on, could you please don't tweet? And I'm going to explain why. The reason is quite simple. I go around the world having to sort out and talk to people about a whole bunch of problems. And over the past several years, I've seen too many delicate negotiations being screwed up just simply because somebody tweeted somebody else out of context. So I'm making a deal with you. When you see the sign go on, please don't tweet. Otherwise, I'm sure Deb would be pleased to hear you tweet about what a great event it is. So here you are. You can tweet away now. Okay? If you look at some of the stuff we've been seeing, if you look at some of the headlines we've been looking at over the past month, so this is on YouTube. You can go and see Eric Schmidt, who, as you know, is in the top 100 billionaires list in the United States. And the headline is not about everything else. He talks about a bunch of other things. But the headline is, "Big Breakthroughs About to Happen in Health." And then if you look at what's coming out of other places in the world, and we look at headlines like, "Did Google's NHS patient data deal need ethical approval?" You start wondering, so what exactly is going on at this moment in time? Because if you see, and we could spend just 2 days alone going into these pieces of news. Google's DeepMind tried to justify why it has access to millions of NHS patient records, right? Or a startup owned by Google wants to radically improve the way patients are diagnosed, but is doing something controversial to achieve that goal. And in fact, I thought I'd share with you a few thoughts about what we're seeing written about big data and analytics, right? I'm going to read this because it's become the king of cliches, I think. So, big data is an oil of modern times. It fuels our economy and lubricates most interactions we have with the world. Well, I don't know about that, but anyway. It is at work every time an airline allocates you a seat. I'm not sure that's quite accurate, actually. I've actually worked in the past helping airlines design those systems, and we never really needed big data to do that. Whenever you navigate traffic to a meeting, well, there may be other things, and it has a deep involvement with what products are stocked by your local supermarket. If you think that's making big claims, right? So I've just come back from New Zealand, and I was having a look at what they're doing in New Zealand. Now, as you know, New Zealand is a small country, right? Less than 5 million people. It's smaller than Denmark, it's smaller than most European countries. And yet here I read, transforming social welfare with analytics. Frankly, if in a small country you're not capable to walking into your stressed areas, I mean, do you really need to know? Do you really need big data to know where the problems are in social welfare in Washington? I'd be very surprised if you did that. So I start asking myself, why? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that big data is useless. I'm just saying that some of the claims for it seem to be rather far-fetched. In fact, the next thing I think I'm going to expect is that big data can get me help over my jet lag as I go around things. And I'm sure that's not going to happen in the same way as a whole bunch of other things are not going to happen. Because one of the messages that I'd like to put across to you today is that this discussion is important to us because things have changed a great deal since the first time I came to the United States more than 20 years ago. We now have truly got an internet without borders. And an internet without borders, wherever I go, people give me the impression that what they expect are safeguards without borders and then remedies across borders. And I'd like you to keep those in mind as we think about all kinds of data, including medical data, being sent around the place. Because if we just look at some of the headlines, right? And I'm not endorsing this or contradicting this, but some of the headlines are saying, in the world of big data, privacy invasion is the business model. And I'd like you to ask the question, is that right? And where's the evidence for that, right? And I'd also like you to think about how much things have changed over the past year, and precisely over the past 10 to 20 years. Because if we had to look at, this was news last year, right? It's not news anymore. But I wanted to keep it because we're now, I think, at 1.3 billion, right? But it was news last year, less than a year ago, right? 27th of August of last year, 1 billion people used Facebook on Monday. But if you thought that that was the news, I think that this was the real news. And the real news is that 90% of people seem to be using Facebook on their mobile devices. And I think that's part of the narrative we have to keep thinking about, because this harks back to exactly to what Alvaro Bedoya was talking about a few minutes ago, that the law was simply not prepared for us having, for example, so many mobile devices which are continuously collecting data about ourselves, some of it we know about, a lot of it we're not conscious of, but what we're less conscious of is what happens to that data afterwards. And this is where we have to think about, is the genie well and truly out of the bottle, or can we do something about it? One of the things in which things have changed is, of course, also the video side of life, because Facebook started off text-wise and then quickly expanded. But in fact, if you look at the way that we're using video, you would realize too that if you have something which is hitting 6 billion daily video views, and that has now increased, I think, to nearly 7 billion, we are really changing the way we go around life. And that should make us think the extent to which the principles we've lived by for so long, whether they are still valid. And here I'd like to borrow a headline from Peter Swire, whom many of you may know. When we're talking about the golden age of surveillance, right? So never has there been so much data as we have at this moment in time. And so much of it we've started collecting over the past 20 years. Just go back 20 years and think about it. Most of us didn't have a smartphone 20 years ago. We had a phone perhaps, and you could triangulate data as to our location, but nowhere in the way that you could do it now. But this is going to be something about which I want to talk about now, because when we think about surveillance, I'd like to go back to 1968 for a minute. I'd like to go back to the time when, yes, I was born. I was still a student. In fact, I had finished my studies before the wall came down. But I'd like to read this to you, especially for those of you who, like myself, perhaps can't read it too well from the back. And if only I could write like this. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1968 wrote this: "As every man goes through life, he fills in a number of forms for the record, each containing a number of questions. There are thus hundreds of little threads radiating from every man, millions of threads in all. If these threads were suddenly to become visible, the whole sky would look like a spider's web. And if they materialized like rubber bands, buses and trams and even people would lose the ability to move, and the wind would be unable to carry torn-up newspapers or autumn leaves along the streets of the city." And Solzhenitsyn then actually went on to talk about how when people become conscious of these rubber bands, of these threads, that they might actually modify their own behavior, right? But let's not dwell on that for a minute, though it is a serious consideration. Because today, wherever I go, people want to talk to me about smart cities, right? And smart cities make Solzhenitsyn's concerns look minuscule. Because it's no longer the forms that we fill in, which is what Solzhenitsyn was talking about. It's the electronic tracks that we leave everywhere, and of which most of us are often never conscious. In fact, one of my pet bugs today, it's a tiny one, but it's the problem with English. English doesn't have a word surveillable, right? The French do. The French are there, right? The French have a definition for surveillable. And surveillable is what we have become. The point is, are we surveilled? And one of the things that I'd like you to think about is, how long is it going to take not only to make it from surveillable to surveilled, And have we actually consciously or unconsciously set up a society where we can be surveilled the instant that somebody wants to surveil us? And that is something which I'd like to share my concern about. Because especially, this is a mouse pad actually, which says always online. And I think it's a useful reminder to where we are. Because let's just ask a quick question, right? So how many of you at this moment in time have, okay, no, I'm going to change the question. Does anybody in the room not have a smartphone? One? Okay, so we have a minority of one. Does anybody, and why am I saying that? Because if your data is not on, then I bet you're probably onto the Wi-Fi system here just to save some of your data. But most people are always on. Always on is actually the title of a book, but that's 8 years ago. But if you look at the stats and where they've come to, it reminds you that we're always online inside. We're always online outside. In fact, some of us would have us believe that there are other people who are online or other beings which are online. And of course, I found that on the internet, ladies and gentlemen, so it must be true, right? And this issue of being always online, right, means that we are perpetually leaving footprints, fingerprints, and all other kinds of marks. And I rather like this cartoon because it shows you some of the basic, simple preoccupations out there, right? That once it's online, it's virtually impossible to scrub out, and the data on you will follow you around for life. Are these perceptions correct? A. Should it be that way? B. And is there anything we can do about it? C. And of course, this is where, I go back to some of the three lines which I learned in my first year constitutional law, and which have kind of formed part of my philosophy of life ever since, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, I was born in a small Catholic country where I would keep telling people, especially the Catholics, do you really think that we're going to be miserable in the afterlife? I mean, is it worth being miserable, or is happiness what it's all about? And I'm really a great believer in happiness. I don't want to be alive if I'm not happy. And frankly, if somebody brought me a certificate which says you will definitely be unhappy in heaven, I don't want to go to heaven. I want to be happy. And what does happiness is like? Because, happiness is all about the good life, isn't it? And when we think about the good life, what do we think of? To some people it is the beach, to others. But how do you get to the good life, and how do you manage the risks along the way? Because I don't often quote Richard Branson. But on this point, my main point here was talking about risk, right? And what he's talking about is every risk is worth taking as long as it's for a good cause and contributes to a good life. Okay, so apart from flying on his airlines and making him a bunch of money, what do we think about when it comes to good life? And are smart cities worth the risk? Okay, so I've deliberately chosen two quotations which take us back more than 30 years. And the first quotation comes from Paul Seekart in 1983. And I want you to think about it because this to me is part of the context, part of the essential context about big data and medical data. Let me read it out to you. In a society where modern information technology is developing fast, many others may be able to find out how we act. And that in turn may reduce our freedom to act as we please. Because once others discover how we act, they may think that it is in their interest, or in the interest of society, or even in our own interest, to dissuade us, discourage us, or even stopping us from doing what we want to do, and seek to manipulate us to do what they want to do. And I had commented about this about 30 years ago, and this is one of those funny things in life. After 30 years, I can't bring myself to disagree with myself, so you're going to have to suffer me for the next few lines. Because what I said then was, shorn of the cloak of privacy that protects him, an individual becomes transparent and therefore manipulable. And a manipulable individual is at the mercy of those who control the information held about him. And his freedom, which is often relative at best, shrinks in direct proportion to the extent of the nature of the options and alternatives which are left open to him by those who control the information. And I'm saying this too because when we look about the good life, when we talk about the quality of life, it is defined by some values. And I'd like to stop for a minute to talk about the right to free development of personality. And I'll illustrate that in a minute, but I want you to think about how much many of us value autonomy, right? Autonomy of action, autonomy of thinking, which is why, if you're thinking about autonomy and manipulation, most of us don't want to be manipulated. Most of us would like to think that when it comes to our own personality, we would like to know who we are. And after discovering who we are, which is a continuous process, we would also like to develop our personalities in any direction we would like to. To me, this is all part of the American dream, too. If the American dream is not about deciding where I want to go in life, how I want to become, who I want to become, then I really don't know what it's all about. And which is why I tie not only the fundamental underlying philosophy of the American dream to also the free development of personality. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But it's all got to right. We talk about political self-determination, but when it comes to privacy and other rights, information-related rights, I suggest that we should, in the same way as the Germans have been doing, talking about informational self-determination. I don't have too much time to go into this, but if you go to my blog, you'll see that I've broken with a rule that I've had with myself, which is never talk about my family. To be fair, I went and got consent, explicit and informed consent from all of my 3 daughters before I spoke about them. But if I can share this with you for a minute, I am blessed with 3 wonderful daughters, 3 lovely people. And you know what? They went to the same school. They have the same parents. They lived in the same home. They've gone to the same university. And yet they are 3 completely different personalities. And those of you who have siblings or kids can probably confirm what I'm saying here, because it's not only a matter of genetics, it's not only the classic arguments of nature and nurture, but it's also the choices that they make for themselves. And for a long time in my department, I think we were probably the first IT law and computer law department on the planet to hire full-time cognitive psychologists, because we're very interested in the way that cognitive science interacts with law and with legal reasoning, and why we do things. The question is, why do we do what we do? And yet, even as we go through the cognitive science aspects of personality, we do find out that ultimately people are putting out a privacy shield around themselves, not between the United States and companies, but they are putting a shield around themselves within which they can develop, right? So I remember the discussions my wife and I had when the first questions starting popping up, like, can my boyfriend sleep over, right? And I won't keep you in suspense. The answer was yes. But it wasn't an easy answer to come up with, but we decided that in the same way as we had had the opportunity to discover our own sexuality and discover themselves by developing their own sexuality, they had the same right too. So we tried our best to make sure that privacy of their bedrooms was also maintained as holy as possible when the boyfriends went around. When they weren't, we still had the right to go in and claim that the place was a tip and they had to clear up. But that's a different story, isn't it? But you will understand that I've used my daughters as an example to try to understand why privacy is so important in the way that people develop their own sexuality. Over the past 6 weeks, 8 weeks alone, yesterday was yet another example, I have had many people from some minorities, like the LGBTI minorities, come forward and say how useful they have found the concept of unhindered development of personality, which incidentally is a constitutional right in Brazil, it's a constitutional right in Colombia, it's a constitutional right in Germany, it's a constitutional right in many countries. And I ask myself, if we are so close in values, and we are very close in values with our friends, colleagues, cousins, and relatives in the United States, why it hasn't made it into law here? As Alvaro said, we could probably discuss this until kingdom come, right? The disparity between the American dream and the American way of doing things. And nobody's telling the Americans, don't do things your own way. Of course you can do things your own way. But does it hurt to ask how much it's costing to do it your own way? Is it really the most cost-efficient way? One of the discussions which I hope to carry forward after this speech, during coffee breaks and lunch breaks today and tomorrow, hopefully with some of those who will join up with me in pursuing the subject of privacy and healthcare on a longer term. But one of the things we have to ask ourselves, to what extent is health data in the United States part of the American way of doing things? And to what extent is the American way of doing things being exported to Europe and other places? And to what extent is that healthy for everybody involved? And no puns on health here. Because when you think about it, right? The United States has chosen a more fragmented approach to privacy protection than Europe has, which is strange because it was actually the United States which started off the more recent discussions on privacy. So one of the great interesting mysteries to me over the past 33 years that I've worked on privacy has been, how is it that between 1966 and 1973, the United States was leading the way in discussing privacy and laws about privacy, etc. It sneezed. Europe caught pneumonia from the sneeze. And Europeans said, the Americans are right. It's such a good idea. They're right. We need to do something about it. Because this is exactly what happened in Europe. The Europeans studied what was happening in the United States. And then between 1976 and 1980, the very same committee came up with two legal instruments. The first one is one of the most influential legal treaties we've had over the past 60 years, which is the Council of Europe's Convention 108, the Treaty on Data Protection. But the second one, which was actually published before the Convention, was the first recommendation on the protection of medical data. It was the first sectoral recommendation that the Europeans made, because medical data to them was the most sensitive thing that they were looking at. I was honored and privileged to be first the vice chair, and then the chair of the group in Europe, which revised that recommendation between 1990 and 1997. And we have traced the extent to which that recommendation has since found its way into most European law about the matter. And I'm mentioning this because when you look at why this became so important to Europeans, the Europeans said, and this is where we start seeing some differences, the Europeans said, the Americans are right, we need to be concerned. We have a fundamental human right to privacy. That's found in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Let's do something about it. And the Europeans took a three-tiered approach. They first have the Convention on Human Rights. Underneath that, they put in two pieces of legislation, which is the European Data Protection Convention of 1981, followed by 1995, the EU directive. And under that, they've put in a whole deal of subsidiary legislation. Regulations which deal with medical health, which deal with statistical data, with police data, so on and so forth. And this model has continued. But there's never the worry that you need a new law to tackle it, because there is a general principle which is inspiring everything, which is covering everything. And I'd like to relate this to what I was talking about in the United States, because we have to understand the economics of privacy and the economics of health data. And the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, we don't yet have enough evidence which shows as to whether things are being done properly and most efficiently. What we do know is that the United States is different. That we know. What we do know is that the United States spends more than 17% of its GDP on healthcare, which is between twice and 3 times of what most European states spend, but is not number one in healthcare. And in most cases, except 2, the United States ranks between 17 and 28 on the healthcare list around the world. Which from the outside, and we must be careful not to be too superficial here, suggests that it's costing a lot, certainly, but is it producing the desired result, which should be the quality of healthcare? So yes, there is an American way of doing things, and what I'm openly doing with you, I'm questioning it, is it the most cost-efficient way to do it? And to what extent does the sale and resale of health data within that system contribute to inflating the final price to the taxpayer, citizen, and patient? And also, I'd like to share another thought with you, which is about two months ago, I can't remember when I was speaking in Wisconsin, and one of the speakers was talking about the American way of protecting privacy through several small fragmented laws. Now, apart from the fact that that leaves holes and gaps, etc., what I'd like you to ask yourself as a question is, how much more is it costing the American taxpayer and the American citizen to administer privacy in this way? And perhaps more importantly, how much more confusing has this made it to the same citizen and patient? Because if you are a patient, if you are a citizen, do you really know in a cost-effective and simple way what is the best way to protect yourself and your rights? And this is something I can happily say or unhappily say. The United States has probably one of the most complex systems of protecting personal data. And perhaps you should be asking yourselves a question, and please make sure that you get the nuances right. I'm not saying that there is no privacy protection in the United States, far from it. I'm not saying that some United States legislation doesn't have teeth, far from it. In fact, some of it has more teeth than the European one does. I'm not saying that privacy is not protected. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there a better way to do it? What I'm saying is there a cheaper, more cost-effective way to do it, and one which is simpler for the poor citizen to understand? That's what I'm saying. And I'm saying this because when you think about information flows in society, because this is what we're talking about. Solzhenitsyn was talking about the wind and the newspapers and the leaves being tossed around by the wind. But we're not only talking about the flow of air now. We're talking about the flow of information in society and its effect on the distribution of power in society. And we're talking about the flow of information in society, and when it comes to big to big data, we're also talking about the distribution of wealth in society. Whose money goes where and why? And this is the way we want to do it. So what I'm saying, to a certain extent, it's the election season, so you'll forgive me if I've put in an American president on the right, on your left. It's the economy stupid, and what I'm saying, it's your health data stupid, right? And what I'm also questioning is, are we being stupid about smart cities, big data, open data, and patient privacy? Because, and I'd ask you to do this in sequence, right? What do others understand by the term smart city, right? What is a smart city? And where do we need big data on smart city? So try Googling it and try Googling the images. And the results not only help you understand the many features that are being considered to be benefits from smart cities, but they do the same, and then do the same. Google big data, open data, smart cities, and health, right? And ask yourself, are they all benefits? Are they really all benefits? Or are these supposed benefits a double-edged sword? And the final question I'm posing here, will the aggregation of all data lead to an acceptable deterioration of our quality of life? So bye-bye the pursuit of happiness, bye-bye the good life. Which is why, I keep asking ourselves, so we're going for smart everything, well, except us. Are we being smart about this? So before going on to health data again, I'd like to reflect a bit about privacy, aggregating data, big data, and rewriting the social contract, right? So if we go back, you'll forgive a student who did start off with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the social contract, right? But the social contract lies at the very fundamentals of the US Constitution. It lies at the very fundamentals of US Constitutional law. It has influenced legal thinking in the United States, whether you like it or not, for a very long time. Indeed, since the beginning of the United States. Well, what's happening, instead of having a constitutional convention where so many brilliant leading Americans sat down and by 1776 were producing declarations and writing constitutions and subsequently amendments, what I'm suggesting is somebody rewriting the social contract, especially over the past 10 years, and is somebody rewriting it without telling us about it? Because, and I'm sure this theme is going to crop up in some of the other, implicitly or explicitly in some of the other keynote speeches lined up for these 2 days. Because, first of all, what we do have at this moment in time, if we look at the internet, we do see private corporations which have taken advantage of technology development, but they put the fine print of their business model into very fine print indeed, right? And this is one of the things which we've started discussing today, which is what are corporations doing with data? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that corporations are not entitled to use data. And I'm not saying that everything they do is unnecessarily intrusive. But what I'm saying is, at this moment in time, a lot of what they do remains opaque, and some of what we know about what they do does not seem to be very savory. So, and governments aren't that much, they're not faring that much better than corporations, because they too have been taking advantage of the technologies. And we've seen the Snowden revelations confirm to us what's happening there. And why am I saying this? Because privacy is intrinsically linked to trust. And we are here in a conference talking about medical data. There are a number of medical practitioners in the room, and they all started off by taking the Hippocratic Oath and protecting their patients' data. And sometimes when you look at the way that corporations are handling data, especially in the United States, you begin asking yourself, so what exactly has become of the Hippocratic Oath? And I'm going to talk about the safeguards that are supposed to have been brought in, and specifically anonymization and de-identification. But the point I'd like to make here is that we don't have a homogeneous world. If you go to Europe, in Europe, some citizens in some countries trust their governments more than they trust corporations. In other countries, they distrust their governments and they trust corporations more. And you don't need me to tell you what you prefer here in the United States and whom you trust more. Though, of course, if I listen to a couple of your presidential candidates, I can be put in doubt myself too there. So here's one of those signs. I'm going to ask you, please don't tweet. Because what I'm going to tell you now is not science fiction. What I'm going to tell you now, so if you can't understand that, don't worry, I've got a translation, right? This is an extract straight from the State Council in China. And it's addressed, so this is this, and it's addressed to all provincial, autonomous region, and municipal people's governments, all state council ministries and commissions, all directly subordinate departments, and it is called the Planning Outline for the Construction of a Social Credit System 2014-2020 is hereby issued to you, and the words, those famous words, please implement it earnestly. So let's spend the next 10 minutes or so examining what 1.3 billion Chinese are expected to implement earnestly. That's roughly the number, roughly, because I can never believe these things, the number of internet users in China, which is more than double the population of the United States in terms of internet use alone. And that's where we see internet use in China going, roughly, up to around 827 million by 2019. And I've got to remind you, of course, that China's quite different. One of the areas where it is different from the United States, though in some areas it's pretty similar, that it's got 2 million microblog monitors. Just in case you haven't understood what that means, that's a euphemism for saying that the Chinese state has 2 million internet police simply dedicated to finding out what Deb and Chip and Alvaro and Joe are saying on the Chinese internet. We reckon they have up to another 1 million doing other things, policing other things on the internet. And of course, this is why the Chinese have become experts in censoring themselves too. But I'm not even going to talk to you myself. I'm going to let the headlines talk to you, right? China to use big data to rate citizens in new social credit system. So what exactly do they mean by this, right? Because amongst other things, the Chinese internet police are joining Weibo, joining the social media, to post about what is being censored. So you have to understand how complex this culture is, because here in the United States and in Europe, I have to talk about the government not using the law to legitimize backdoors into encryption. The Chinese don't care about backdoors. The Chinese want the front doors thrown wide open, and they want to drive a horse and carriage through. I am not making a value judgment, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just simply explaining to you how this culture, which, if you look at my writings, I sincerely believe enjoys privacy, or should I say, would like to enjoy privacy, but I will say values privacy, privacy of the community as well as privacy of the individual. But it knows that the flow of information in Chinese society is being censored, is being manipulated. Let's look at one example to see how it's being manipulated. 3rd March 2012. A 20-year-old student goes out from a public restroom at a produce market in Tibet. She's soaked in gasoline and with a defiant fist in the air, sets herself on fire. She was protesting a policy change at Maku County. Basically, she was protesting switching to Chinese from Tibetan as the language of instruction. The incident made the news all over the Western media. But most ordinary people living in China will never hear about it. Because the police on the scene took her body back to the restroom, collected everybody's cell phones, and methodically deleted all photographs of the incident. And China's state media, Xinhua, reported that the girl suffered from mental instability after hitting her head on a radiator. Now, I'm inviting you to think about this, to also think about the way the internet and flow of the internet in China may be used to manipulate people in a different direction. And I'd like to acknowledge some of this information coming from an excellent site carried out, China Copyright and Media's, done by a Dutch researcher who's actually using Dutch money in the UK at this moment in time. But I'd like to take you back a bit to what this means in China. That China has a plan to give every citizen a character score. So what does this mean? This means that if it were Alvaro or myself, we would have not only an ID card and a number, but that ID card and the number which we use for everything has a score with it. And that score goes up and down. Is Alvaro a good teacher? Yes, no. Is Alvaro has he paid his rent on time? Yes, no. And everything is computed into the score. Is it important? What are they collecting the score for? Try to take a bank loan. I'll look at your score. Try to rent an apartment. I look at your score. Are you on a dating website? I want to look at your score. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not science fiction. This is what I want to explain to you. This is not science fiction. This is a serious plan delivered, being deployed in a focused, resourced way by one of the largest economies on the planet, with the largest population on the planet, by a country which is a permanent member of the UN's Security Council. And I agree with Michael Fertig that this is the most staggering, publicly announced, scaled use of big data I've ever seen. And if you think that more people in the United States should know about privacy and health data, you've also tried to look at the bigger picture and see how many people know what's going on in China. In the social credit system in China, they're going to be looking at financial credibility, criminal record, social media behavior, and, as we're saying, from 2020 onwards, each citizen should, besides his identity card, have such a credit code. I want to spend 3 minutes thinking a bit more about it so you would understand what we mean by big data when we get back to medical data. How good a citizen are you? This is the question, right? China hopes to answer that question for every one of its citizens with a numerical rating system based on their financial standing, their criminal record, and social media behavior. And China aims to utilize big data to hold all citizens accountable for financial decisions as well as moral choices. Let's go into this a bit more deeply, right? So, What the social credit system includes is where you go, what you buy, who you know, how many points are on your driving license, how your pupils rate you, how you're evaluated in your career as a doctor, lawyer, or teacher. They've got a number of sites piloting this and busy aggregating and sharing the data already. They have some of the biggest sites in China, including the biggest dating sites, the biggest, all aggregating the data. It's a mega platform, and Clement Chen claims that the real threat will arise when the government collates myriad other sources, painting a complete picture of its citizens and data. It aims to collect nearly every aspect about citizens and integrate it into a mega platform. So this information can be shared between public bodies. Yeah, this I found particularly interesting. So those of you who are still interested in dating sites, look at this. One of the most high-profile projects is by Sesame Credit, the financial wing of Alibaba, which, as you know, is one of the biggest online shopping sites. With 400 million users, Alibaba is the world's biggest online shopping platform. It uses its unique database of, hang on, I've hit something, of consumer information to compile individual social credit scores. Users are encouraged to flaunt their good credit scores to friends and even potential mates. China's biggest matchmaking service, Baihe, has teamed up with Sesame to promote clients with good credit scores, giving them prominent spots on the company's website. A person's appearance is very important, explains Baihe's vice president, Swan Hyong. But it's more important to be able to make a living. Your partner's fortune guarantees a comfortable life. Let's go on a bit. And I think this quote from Rogier Krims, Rogier is the person who's been translating a lot of this. I can't read Mandarin for now, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm relying on his translations. But Rogier has said this terrifically important insight, and I'm going to read it because it's important. With the help of the latest internet technologies, the government wants to exercise individual surveillance. In his view, the surveillance will have a wider scope than was the case under the former East German system. The German aim was limited to avoiding a revolt against the regime. The Chinese aim is far more ambitious. It is clearly an attempt to create a new citizen. And he's right about this. And this is what makes it even more interesting as a social experiment. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not comments. These are bits of the directive from the government which are directly translated. That's why they are there in inverted commas. Accelerating the construction of a social credit system is an important basis for comprehensively implementing the scientific development view and building a harmonious socialist society. It has important significance for strengthening the sincerity consciousness of the members of society. Look at those words, sincerity consciousness. And the guiding ideology, the name of a subsection in the memo, you have a heading called Guiding Ideology, states that a key principle of the system is government promotion. Do you see what I mean when I talk about no back doors here, ladies and gentlemen? They're stating up front, this is what we want to do. And the key question that I'm going to ask you to ask yourselves is, how far are we away from this in the rest of the world? Because it's not only the Chinese who have credit scoring. We've had credit scoring for a long time. It may not be engineered in the same way, but could it be going in the same way? Possibly without government intervention? Should we be doing something about it? Is this the kind of social policy we'd like to see? And so it is a moral dimension to social engineering we're looking at, because the intentions of the new system are not only economical, fighting fraudulent practices, but also moral, right? That's why I was talking about socialist core values, right? And a bad credit code can result in being not eligible for certain jobs, housing, or credit to start a company. On the labor market, you might need a certain score to get a specific job, right? And Human Rights Watch in China, in Hong Kong, is saying that this is a scary vision of the future. And why? Because currently there is intensive surveillance of sensitive groups such as dissidents. But the social credit system goes to another level. This is an effort of surveillance of all people. So what's the point? Right? And the point why I've chosen this case study is this the kind of society we want to live in? Is this the kind of society we already live in? Is this the kind of society we want to avoid? Is this the kind of society we wish to permit? Is this a matter on which public policy should intervene? And if so, how different a piece of social engineering should this be from China's? And when we look, when I look at how I woke up to big data, right? And one of the first things, the privacy scholars in the room will recognize this paper, right? Broken promises of privacy responding to the surprising failure of anonymization. Now, I hope some of you will remember that about 3 or 4 slides or 5 slides into this presentation, I had remedies and safeguards, because this is what we have to focus on, right? What are the safeguards when it comes to big data? And up till now, we've been told constantly, you have anonymization, you have de-identification. And later on, in these 2 days, we're going to have the honor and privilege to listen to Latanya Sweeney, who is one of the world's greatest experts on reverse engineering from anonymized data to telling you that this medical data belongs to the governor of a certain state. And this is fundamentally, in fact, let me show my age now. You see, when I started off at the Council of Europe more than 30 years ago, discussing safeguards, this was when we still thought that anonymization was a decent safeguard. But in fact, if you look at all the papers that we've seen, this comes from the UK, Big Data and Data Protection. If you look at the reports produced by the European Data Protection Supervisor, I'm sticking to European examples, but I'll get to American ones in a minute, right? Privacy and competitiveness in the age of big data. Yet another one, privacy and competition in the digital economy, antitrust, privacy and big data. We've seen so many reports coming out about big data, right? And I thought I'd pull this up because this is just out fresh, right? This article is enabling big data through Europe's new data protection regulation. I'm drawing your attention to this article, not necessarily because I'm endorsing it for correctness, but because it is interesting. It raises a point, a nuance, which is slightly different to something that I've made publicly, which is dealing with, have the Europeans actually found a way to reconcile the irreconcilable? Because the Europeans always went by with the principle that one of the basic sacrosanct principles of data protection is that data can only be collected for a specified purpose, which is legitimate at law, and that purpose must be the guiding principle for the future users of that data. And so the main question is, can you repurpose data? That is the main question in European law, right? And of course, big data, the very concept of big data analytics is how can we use masses of data collected for one purpose, but can we use them for another purpose? And where you step in and say is, what are the safeguards in such a situation? We've had plenty of reports. This is an American report, Privacy and Big Data. And what's interesting is that the FTC, completely by coincidence, I was having dinner next to Julie Brill yesterday evening, but Reclaim Your Name was part of the what the FTC started off on big data in 2013. That led to letters being addressed to the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and eventually saw the first reports coming out from the White House too. Big data, seizing opportunities, preserving values, right? The Obama White House came out to that in 2014, 2015. We have big data, seizing opportunities, preserving values, the interim progress report. And what are we being told here, right? What did this lead to? Well, I'm told that there's a possibility that Senator Edward Markey will be with us this evening for the gala dinner. But Markey, Blumenthal, Whitehouse, and Franken actually introduced legislation in March of last year to try to have a beginning on regulating transparency and accountability in the data broker industry. A few, nobody's better informed than Alvaro on this, a few US legislators have started waking up to the issues which lie in the data brokerage industry. Because that's what it's become, and perhaps nowhere more so than the United States. I'm not saying that people outside the United States don't sell data. Of course they do. And of course there are American companies which sell data to European companies. Of course there are American companies which go to Europe, buy medical data and ship it back here, yes. But is this subject to a proper policy discussion, a proper regime? And this is part of why the big data and big health information discussion has to go forward properly. As I move towards a conclusion, I'd like to remind you about two things, because one thing that wasn't in my title, but which should always be there, is that you can never, and this is a main point I'd like to make here, over the next 2 days, as we listen to other people talk about medical data, we should keep the other two words in mind, and they are not big data. The two words are open data, right? Because in the United States, on May 9th, 2013, President Obama signed an executive order that made open and machine-readable data the new default for government information. The idea is clear. The data is being looked at as a resource which can be tapped into and mined. Because, ladies and gentlemen, to a considerable extent, I feel comfortable in saying that big data analytics are no threat or are a negligible threat if you don't have open data. You need open data. It's the policy of open data which makes other data available and permits you to link up several databases and several data sets together. And in fact, a lot of Latanya Sweeney's work has focused on data which has been put into the public domain and then somehow latched onto. It's not only a United States issue. In the EU legislated in favor of reutilizing public data more than 12 years ago, right? So now I think you get the drift. The Chinese have a policy, it's there, clear. The United States has a policy. The EU has a policy, has had one for 12 years. And it's open data, making the data open, permitting us to then use big data analytics to go in and analyze vast data sets, taking them together. And in my report to the United Nations, which I presented on the 9th of March of this year, you will notice that I consider the subject to be so important that I've dedicated a whole annex to big data and open data. I don't have the time to go into it here, but the conclusion is clear. And I'm going to read my conclusion because, and you're not going to be surprised to hear it now, that I am very concerned that entire nations or trading blocs, including major nations or regional federations such as China, the European Union, and the United States, have adopted or are adopting open data and big data policies, the far-reaching consequences of which may not as yet be properly understood and which may unintentionally put in peril long-standing social values as well as the fundamental rights to privacy, dignity, and free development of one's personality. Some studies on posthumous privacy suggest that in 2016, the citizens of some countries may be better off dead from a privacy point of view, since the rights to privacy are better protected by law if they are dead than if they are alive, in a world where open data and big data analytics are a way of life endorsed by the information policies of the countries concerned. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I think that the discussion we're having here is so important. It's so important because we have to decide whether we're going to have no privacy by design, and the antithesis of privacy by design, as I see it at this moment in time, is China. But you will understand that I have to engage with the Chinese and get them on board, which is why I have appealed to you not to tweet about that. The EU is an open question. On the one hand, it's saying it wants to have the right to purpose. On the other hand, some people like Victor, whom I quoted earlier, detect that there might be a couple of loopholes which can be used for big data in Europe. In the USA, we've seen the first attempts at data brokers, but had it not been for events like today and events organized by other privacy-sensitive NGOs, the question about the use and reuse of medical data and other data is not being asked. And I'm asking openly, and I hope we can move towards some answers by the end of these 2 days, can the USA provide a lead, especially in health data? Or is it about to learn the hard way? Right? And it's with those questions that I thank you very much for your attention, and I ask you, if you have any questions, please feel free to make them. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure you're all extremely pleased to be challenged by the great questions that you are asking and what we're focusing on here. And we've been, I think it's wonderful that you think that health data can have a place in where we're going, and that's what we think here. When we look at what our public believes, the information that they care the most about controlling is information about their minds and bodies. And we've talked about the need to study if that's what people feel across the world and across cultures. And we really you've given us such a rich way to look at these sessions and for everyone to participate and think about these key questions. And we've all been hearing the meme, you didn't even call it that, but data just wants to be free. Really? Data just wants to be free. But that's everywhere, and that's what people talk about here, and it's all supposed to be about great things. But obviously, what he's just shown us about a certain other part of the world is quite terrifying. And those of us who took English classes and read literature, we certainly read novels that predicted the future. And this is really terrifying to see the details coming into effect. So what's so wonderful about Joe is he's going to be here so that he can hear from you and he can participate in sessions and help us take the challenges that we're facing and come to some ways of working together and advancing patients' and personal rights to personality. And of course, I love that he talks about personality since I'm a psychoanalyst, and that's what I work with. And I can certainly, everybody who lives in a family knows all the children are different, all the people are different, and they do have a right to determine their personality, and it has a lot to do with their family. And the things that we've heard are just frankly mind-blowing. Thank you so much for your incredible synthesis of law. And Chip, did you want to make a comment? So we're a little bit behind schedule, but wow, that was incredibly worth it. We'll take a few minutes for the first panel to come up, and which is going to be